In the tropics just last year, we lost about almost 7 million hectares of primary rainforest. So if you think about that, that's just last year. It's the size of Panama. A lot of that was due to fires. A lot of that was due to agricultural expansion so that we can have, more access to hamburgers and steaks and cattle grazing. Nature-based solutions has this idea at its core that it's about inclusive processes where you get maximum benefits that involve nature, biodiversity, but include climate and all of these other social and economic benefits. I can give you an example from looking at mangroves, where we can protect and restore mangroves, and it would cost less than $100 billion, but would create over $1 trillion in benefits. We know that anywhere from 5 to 8% of global food production relies on animal pollination. So, that's natural capital. Imagine what it would cost to try to go in and pollinate in any other way.
Environmental destruction is pervasive, but do we truly understand its consequences on our climate? Do we fully appreciate the interconnectedness of biodiversity loss and climate change? To answer this critical question, I'm joined by Dr. Susan Gardner, Director of Ecosystems Division at United Nations Environment Programme, who has over 3 decades of experience in international environment policy making, working for both Mexican and the US government. Today, she highlights the immense potential of nature-based solutions in response to climate crisis and their ability to generate economic, social, environmental benefits simultaneously. She also highlights the importance of integrating ecosystem services into economic decision making and the important work that is happening at UNEP for the same. I truly hope this conversation fills you with the same optimism it gave me. Dr. Gardner, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. It's an honor to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Anirudh. It's my pleasure to join you. I'm looking forward to it.
Dr. Gardner, right now there are 2 stories that are unfolding in our planet in front of us. One is that of changing climate, and the other one is that of disappearing nature. Now, we sometimes treat these 2 things as separate, but we know from your work at UNEP and what you've been advocating for that in fact it's a part of the same story. With that context, can we begin this conversation by first learning that how biodiversity and climate change are interrelated, and maybe you could shed some light with respect to its shared drivers and consequences?
Well, certainly, and I'm glad to have this chance to talk with you about these interlinkages, the importance of biodiversity for climate, the major impacts that we're seeing of climate on biodiversity, because they are interlinked. And we know nature can be one of our greatest allies in the fight for climate stability. It has a really essential role in regulating climate, in ensuring that that there are ways to reduce flooding, to stabilize water, to actually help stabilize temperatures, to absorb carbon. And at the same time, because of the rising temperatures, climate is having massive effects on species. So their standard foraging areas, where they migrate to, the habitats they use, the temperatures that they are seeking. So there's this real interlinkage between both climate and biodiversity. We know when we look at the targets of the Paris Agreement, nature is essential for achieving, IPCC says, up to 30% of the greenhouse gas reductions that are needed to stay within 2 degrees Celsius. So nature is truly an ally in our fight to stabilize climate. So on the mitigation side, when we lose biodiversity, we actually reduce our ability to fight climate, because trees and soil and peatlands, they all are huge ocean sinks. You had a speaker recently from Scripps at Lisa Levin who was talking about the ocean and the importance of the ocean absorbing carbon. And so all of nature, land and sea, absorbs carbon that's released and helps to mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions or the reduction of those emissions. At the same time, it also makes us more resilient to climate. So it acts as a natural buffer, for example, to flooding, to stabilizing water against droughts. We've seen a lot of areas where healthy ecosystems can reduce wildfires. So we see nature being an ally both on the mitigation side as well as the adaptation side. But it is a bit of a vicious cycle. So, for example, you get high temperatures caused by climate change that make forests drier, right? A forest that can be a great asset in helping to stabilize water. So as forests become drier, they become more vulnerable to wildfires. And then as you have wildfires increasing, they're actually releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. That's actually speeding up the heating process. So you're seeing these vicious cycles, but which we can actually turn into to opportunities where nature helps climate. And climate is, as we are able to stabilize the climate, that becomes very important in conserving the biodiversity we currently have.
Dr. Gardner, you mentioned about the vicious cycle, and I think that is where it gets more interesting because that often gets overlooked, that how these two things feed into each other. This makes me think that is there any particular feedback loop between biodiversity loss and climate change that is still often underlooked by the public or the policymakers? Because I'm assuming that we're talking about such intricate ecosystems, such intricate biodiversity mechanisms in which they're enmeshed with each other. Is there something that we are overlooking?
Well, we know a lot. Science has a lot of solutions. Science has a lot of data and evidence that points us into how we can solve these problems. It often is not as much about what we know and what we're able to do. It's more about our political will to take the actions that we know are needed and to do it at the scale and the urgency that's required. We could think of one example of this interlinkages of climate and biodiversity when we think of the drivers, because oftentimes drivers of biodiversity loss also are drivers of climate change and deforestation, wetland draining, urban expansion. These reduce biodiversity, reduce habitat, and also have carbon implications. And food production is one of the biggest sources. Food is responsible for about a third of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So 1/3 of the problem is due to the way that we produce food. There's the food production part in terms of what happens inside the farm, but also the transportation, the processing, waste disposal, all of that is a big contributor to loss of land, to production of greenhouse gases. But then you also have emissions that are caused by the changing in land use. So when you start to expand into forest and cause deforestation, you're actually destroying biodiversity, you're destroying habitats, and you are destroying nature's ability to be an absorption of those greenhouse gases. Agriculture is probably responsible for more than half of global land degradation, and particularly more than, one of the biggest contributors to total deforestation. In the tropics just last year, we lost about almost 7 million hectares of primary rainforest. So if you think about that, that's just last year. It's the size of Panama. A lot of that was due to fires. A lot of that was due to agricultural expansion so that we can have, more access to hamburgers and steaks and cattle grazing. And so these are things we know. We know that agriculture is one of the largest drivers of biodiversity loss because of the land use change, but also one of the biggest contributions to climate change. And we know that it doesn't mean that people stop eating. It means that we have to produce our food in sustainable ways, because there's real consequences if we don't. And so those interlinkages, regardless of which type of drivers you're talking about, we just keep seeing over and over again. The solutions benefit both. We can take actions that have benefits for both, and they make a lot of sense, right? They make a lot of sense. They're available, they're cost effective, and they're things that we know we have to do.
Dr. Gardner, you talk about actions that benefit both. One wherein we can make sustainable food choices to eat, and the other wherein we can have benefits for the environment as well. So I think after laying out the problems as you've just mentioned, it's a perfect segue for us to talk about the other segment that about nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are solutions that have the ability to generate co-benefits so that the environment remains in balance as well. Now, I know that for you, it's an integral part of your work. And I think it's something I wish gets more traction, at least more than technological solutions, which keep coming up again and again. I see that there's a need for both, but I would be very grateful if you could explain what nature-based solutions are, its core principles, some of the solutions that you have seen have gained traction in the recent days, and maybe what kind of impact they have had in the recent past.
It is one of my favorite topics, so thank you for asking me about nature-based solutions. There was a decision by all member states of the United Nations and the Environment Assembly to actually create a definition for nature-based solutions, so we could be exactly clear about what they are. Because they're essentially actions that are aimed at protecting, conserving, restoring, or using in a sustainable way our natural resources. That can be terrestrial, marine, freshwater, coastal, referring to all of nature, while simultaneously providing a human well-being outcome, providing an outcome in terms of a service that's provided by that ecosystem that's protected. So at the essence of nature-based solutions, you're addressing a social, an economic, and environmental challenges all at the same time, simultaneously. You can think, for example, of protection of coral reefs. Coral reefs are biodiversity hotspots. They're absolutely essential in terms of protection of huge, important biodiversity in the ocean. And when you do that, you actually support livelihoods of 1 billion people globally. Because there's a lot of livelihoods, there's a lot of food, there's a lot of flood and storm protection that coral reefs provide. So you think of coral as an opportunity for a nature-based solution, which allows people to benefit. At the same time, the same actions are providing benefits for species. And so we see this in so many examples where a nature-based solutions also provides the carbon benefit. So you're getting carbon mitigation, you're getting protection of biodiversity, you're getting building resilience, you're creating jobs, often you're creating food security, and you're stabilizing water in terms of either flooding or drought. And when done correctly, you can actually ensure that you're engaging local communities and you're ensuring that it's a very inclusive process. So that means that you're empowering women, you're empowering the wisdom of indigenous peoples, you're engaging young people in the solutions. So nature-based solutions has this idea at its core that it's about inclusive processes where you get maximum benefits that involve nature, biodiversity, but include climate and all of these other social and economic benefits. I can give you an example from looking at mangroves because it's such a excellent underused opportunity where we can protect and restore mangroves, and it would cost less than $100 billion, but would create over $1 trillion in benefits before the end of the decade. And then when you have the use of mangroves, these kinds of solutions actually are more durable. So For example, you plant a mangrove, but then over time, that mangrove forest, as it becomes larger, as it becomes wider, actually the benefits increase over time. And they're more cost effective because, you compare the cost of putting in a mangrove forest to putting in infrastructure of traditional style with a seawall or something. The seawall's more expensive. I think a seawall probably costs close to $3,000 to put in versus $600 just to establish mangroves as part of a nature-based solution approach. That was an example of a study we did in Fiji looking at sort of cost comparisons. But then over time, your maintenance costs are much lower, right? And so you can actually see that the nature-based solution is more cost-effective. It lasts longer, and it actually improves over time. Think about, for example, restoring a wetland so that you get water filtration that can provide some of the services that you would get from maintaining complicated infrastructure for a water treatment plant. You get much better returns over time because those wetlands are going to continue to function and just get stronger. So there's a whole lot of examples like this where nature is an ally to helping solve lots of different problems at the same time.
Dr. Gardner, your examples make me go back to your first answer. So, for example, I'm also thinking about the permanence of these nature-based solutions, like the crisis which we are facing today and the kind of vicious cycle you talked about in your previous answer. I'm wondering, is there a concern or a risk for the permanence of such nature-based solutions? So, for example, I can dedicate hectares of land for mangrove restoration, but we also see that because of the vicious cycle and where we are, it's very tough for these ecosystems to survive and thrive, considering how temperature scales are not balanced, they are erratic. And so I'm just thinking about the permanence of these nature-based solutions as well. Do you think that is a concern, and maybe how we could mitigate this concern?
No, it's a very important concern. There's a lot of conversations around tipping points. That once the temperatures get too high, our access to solutions become reduced. Once the ocean becomes overwhelmed, its ability to absorb carbon can become overwhelmed. Then we become much more reliant on other mechanisms, and our solutions become much reduced. Where there are a lot of studies trying to look at how we can already prepare for that reduction in options. So, for example, there's studies looking at coral reefs in different parts of the world to see which ones are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which ones are having the worst and the most biggest impact in terms of coral bleaching, and then trying to find out those that seem a little bit more resilient or those that are able to come back faster. For those, and then seeing, okay, do we start trying to really put our investments focused on protecting those that have the best chance to actually survive over the next decade? I mean, that's a very sad situation to be in, but it is an important thing to be aware of, that if we have to recognize that over the next few decades we're going to lose, some project 90% of our coral, we should really take a look at that 10% that might be able to survive and ensure that we're protecting that to the full extent possible. There's some examples of things that are a bit more resilient, and just using nature to build resilience is part of that solution. So, for example, we look at putting nature into cities, where you put, for example, green infrastructure on roofs. So having plant material on a roof, or putting more parks, with more diversity into park areas with bigger size parks, you can actually reduce heat waves by a significant amount. You can improve the air quality in that city. You can actually allow that green infrastructure can actually absorb water It helps to hold water so that water doesn't just flood away, but actually gets absorbed and more is retained in the soils. And for that reason, they call them sponge cities, because it means that you can actually reduce flooding, but you can also protect against water scarcity. So there are solutions, for example, in cities where we can be looking at how to actually improve the situation just by starting to put more nature into the city already. And as another benefit, there's actually real data that shows that the mental health of the communities are improved. You know, the children with attention deficit can get huge benefits just from spending time outside. And in some cases can replace the need for attention deficit medications. So there's a lot of opportunities that are at our fingertips now. So we have to stay focused on those. We have to stay focused on working quickly and at scale. But I agree with you. The longer we wait, the fewer options we're going to have over time, and that is quite a scary prospect.
And Dr. Gardner, as you say that like this window is shrinking and our options are reducing, the one option that currently is gaining a lot of traction is about valuing natural capital. And I think that's a way with which nature advocates or otherwise there is this growing sense that if we put monetary value to nature, we might be able to generate enough traction. So I'm wondering, like, what is your department or your work, how is that focusing on integrating ecosystem services into the capital ways that we just mentioned?
It's an enormous part of the solutions. I think it's a great example of how we can get real traction. So, I mean, traditionally when you heard of economists talking about capital, they were talking about money and machines, essentially, right? But we know now more about what's important for healthy societies, that it's all kinds of forms of capital. So you need economic capital as well as social and human capital and environmental capital. And so as we look at these different forms of capital, essentially it's saying, look, there's value in these. And when we invest wisely, that value grows. And when we neglect it, you have decline in that value. So natural capital is taking a look at actually living and non-living natural assets. So that can include, air, water, and soils. It can also include plants and animals. And it looks at those, like any other form of capital, it's those benefits that natural capital provides, the services that the ecosystems provide for people. And so, you still, of course, a lot of talk about GDP, but more and more finance ministers and various investors are actually starting to understand that GDP relies heavily on natural capital. So, the ability of a country to continue to support its people, its development, its social capital, its economies, it relies on healthy forests or healthy reefs. It relies on the watersheds the communities depend on. It relies on healthy soils. For example, we know that anywhere from 5 to 8% of global food production relies on animal pollination. So, that's natural capital. Imagine what it would cost to try to go in and pollinate in any other way. And so that's an understanding that we can now put a value on, right? Because that global crop production is, more than $500 billion in value annually in the markets. We know that mangroves can provide flood protection that provides more than $65 billion a year. So if you lose mangroves, there's 15 million or more people that can be flooded around the world every year. And a lot of countries are starting to understand, a lot of economists, a lot of investment companies are understanding that For example, Australia's Great Barrier Reef contributes about $4 billion to Australia's economy and supports tens of thousands of jobs. So understanding that then helps for policy decisions. It helps us to figure out, okay, so we need to recognize that when we don't invest in protecting nature and the ecosystem services that we're getting for free every day, whether you're awake or asleep, ecosystems are producing those services for us. And we've got to recognize there's a value in that, because if we neglect that value and those services disappear, then we start to see real costs, and we can also quantify those costs.
Dr. Gardner, is this a parallel concern about carbon markets that we always hear about, putting a price? The perpetual debate that we have been seeing is about putting a price on nature. And this just makes me think, like, is it easier for us to destroy nature if we put value on it? So, because from what I'm thinking about, this ethical concern that some people also say that if we value nature, it just becomes easy to destroy it because we have commodified it till the time we can pay the bill. I'm more curious from your perspective, what do you see that how would this in fact streamline and make it better for protecting nature, and how these concerns could be redressed?
It's a very important topic, certainly. And, for intrinsically, nature and biodiversity has immeasurable value. But we also know that it's difficult to manage what you don't measure, right? So if you can measure it, then you can understand that where you're making progress. And it's also important to just recognize how are decisions made by governments? Where are the actions needed? So who do we need to act, right? Who do we need to take an action? And in the case of governments, which agencies are important in those decisions?
Yeah.
And, you can look across, you choose any government you want, but we generally see that there are limitations in the scope of what decisions are possible, and often part of that is how to prioritize investment of financial resources, which are always limiting. And today more than ever, we're seeing real financial crisis of having to make difficult decisions about where governments are investing. So you do have to find a way to speak the language of the decision makers. So when we can show concrete examples, for example, our team work in Sri Lanka could show that if you look at a wetland, it has an economic value of about $7.5 million to the people of Colombo. So that's for flood protection, but it's also fishing and water treatment and things like that. It's also for agriculture, right? So it might be, without those numbers, it might be easier or it might be more likely that a decision maker would say, we can actually get some value out of this wetland if we drain it, because we can use it to produce crops, and I'll get X amount of value from those crops. If you're not aware that you're risking a particular value from the services that are being provided because you haven't monetized those, then you don't have the information to really recognize the costs and benefits of different actions. So I think it is about helping countries to understand in economic terms, which is often metrics that are very important in decision making, what are the opportunities to make decisions that actually have more co-benefits, because those co-benefits have real value. That's the way I think about it. But it's very complicated because, when you lose a species, that's immeasurable, right? It's immeasurable. So there's so much, there's very strong rationale on both sides of that argument.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gardner, for laying out the solutions and the work that's been happening. And particularly for myself, when I was preparing for this interview, I had a hard time selecting themes and topics of optimism or things that UNEP is working on because there are just so many. So I leave it up to you that if you want to highlight one solution or one initiative that you've undertaken or is in progress, which makes you very optimistic about our ability to deal with climate change, one that really fuels you and gives you confidence and maybe helps our listeners as well with respect to something that is really shaking the ground as making change happen.
Well, for me, one of the things that gives me a lot of optimism is thinking about restoration. Because when we restore the environment, we have the opportunity to make the world better. And we have the opportunity actually to leave the world better for the next generation than what we inherited from the previous. So I get a lot of optimism thinking that we can fix solutions and that restoration is part of the way that we can actually improve the ecosystem services and the benefits that people get. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration highlights flagships every year and shows, okay, here's examples of where countries or groups of countries and regions, they've actually done restoration in ways that has achieved real benefits and that's working at a meaningful scale to have an impact globally. And so when I have the chance to participate in one of the awards ceremonies where we share with the world these examples of the recipients of one of the flagship awards, it's really inspiring. It's really inspiring. And you see these communities of actors, local communities, and most of the time who are the ones who just came together and said, we're gonna fix this, we're gonna restore this, and they're getting all these benefits. So looking at across, when you go to the website of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is co-led of UNEP and FAO, you can see lots of great examples that can inspire you across the globe of real actions that are working. So that's one of my favorite opportunities is to really look at, okay, there's things that are happening now, and they are making the world a better place. They're helping people, and they are solving these problems.
And is there one area wherein you hope that we could accelerate action much more?
Well, one of the things that's going to help a lot, and we spoke about this a lot last month at the UN Ocean Conference. It was hosted by France and Costa Rica. There's a lot of conversations about how we have to have integrated solutions. So we have to work across different sectors, coming together to find solutions. I have an example here. So I'm here at our UNEP headquarters, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And on the coast of Kenya, we have a project that's called Go Blue. And it's where local communities are restoring mangroves. And as a result, they're getting blue carbon benefits. But they're also getting protection from floods and storms. And so we can see that they're working across different sectors to ensure they're producing a carbon benefit. They're restoring up to 50,000 tons of carbon every year. They're protecting biodiversity. About 4,000 hectares of mangroves are getting protected or restored. They're generating real opportunities for the local community. So they're getting about $600,000 for the local communities just from the carbon credits. And they're creating jobs for young people and for women in particular in this region. So there's economic benefits, there's development benefits, there's carbon benefits, there's community benefits for water stability. There's all these different benefits that cross different parts of government. So they're involving local governments, they're involving national governments, and so they're ensuring that they've got integrated approaches across a whole bunch of different sectors. So that's the kind of example that we can see more of being at scales that allow lots of different benefits across lots of different sectors, where you get the support rather than seeing one pushing back while the other's trying to push forward. We're all pushing forward together.
It was incredible to see recently. I saw your post on coral reefs and the amount of money that has been distributed. I think it was Coral Reef Funds or CRF. I'm forgetting the abbreviation, but the amount of funds that have been distributed to the local communities and the work that's happening. It's really inspiring to see that some of the areas that have been successful in bringing together people across the boardroom and which is establishing successful examples so that nature-based solutions could be adopted more and at scale. So I see that there's a lot of merit there, and congratulations for your work there.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's very kind.
Dr. Gardner, I see that we are inching closer towards the time that we have. But before we conclude this call, I'm just curious because of the unique position where you sit and your background with interacting with scientists, with policymakers, with people like myself who are trying to spread education on climate change. I'm curious, like, what would be your call to action to stakeholders while we are trying to work towards this problem? Because climate change can or is a mammoth challenge, and as we all know, as you talked about mental health, it can have different effects on different people, someone's livelihoods, someone's health, someone's so to say survival as well. So I'm just curious from your vantage point if you can share a call to action.
My pleasure, yes. I mean, part of the solution involves all of us. So it's really important that we all recognize that every person has actions that they can take to contribute to solutions. We have technology, that has advanced to allow us to make great progress. We have science that has identified what are the problems. We have solutions that are available. We actually even have the finance. You often hear like, well, the problem is we just can't afford it. In reality, there's so many, for example, national subsidies that are investing in actions that actually destroy nature. So it actually destroys the opportunity for long-term benefits for the citizens who are paying the taxes. Those subsidies could be repurposed and put in other directions that actually could be supporting industries to take nature positive actions. So there actually are tons of opportunities out there. We have to demand action on them, all of us. So, my call to action is everybody should be speaking up and sharing what you know. Speak up in the way that you do. For so many of your listeners who are influencers across social media, who are active in communicating problems and solutions, start speaking up and sharing what you know and pointing people towards solutions. Because we can get overwhelmed by the catastrophes and by the crises and the information about the disasters. But we can also get inspired by saying, look, we can take action. Let's be informed. Let's make sure that we know, all of us, what are the costs of our actions. So, for those who have the resources to be able to choose between different consumption patterns, make sure you know the impact of those patterns. Understand where your food comes from. If you were fortunate to have the blessing to be born into an area that has food security, know what your options are and the impacts of those different options. And then really push for change. Speak to power. Speak up in your communities, to your community leaderships, to the areas where the decisions are being made. Make sure that you're pushing and demanding change, and that we're talking about the urgency that is needed. So that's my real call to action: is everyone get involved, stay optimistic, don't lose hope, and keep calling for us to move quickly now in the right direction.
And how I hear it is, in the words of Mahatma Gandhi, with what we've grown up, is be the change you want to see in the world. So it's more about reframing the crisis and thinking yourself to be a part of the solution as well. So I think what you've said makes a lot more sense, that to not only fret over what's happening, but to feel the responsibility of taking those actions with which we can help in contributing to whatever we can for solving what we face today. So
You're a wonderful role model for that. Thank you so much for the information you're sharing through this podcast. It's really important.
thank you so much, Dr. Gardner. It's firstly, I'm very grateful that you decided to come for this conversation, and secondly, for your kind words. I'm really hopeful that the initiatives that are happening at UNEP and the kind of impact they are making, they continue to do so and give us the hope that we are already getting, that there are agencies who are working to protect environment. So thank you so much for that.
It's my pleasure.